Sure. Got it. Out of curiosity, does everyone have the PDF from Theory of the Subject that I posted to hand yeah, or the text when it comes to that? I only ask because if not, I will screen share. But if so, I probably won't bother with the third computer. Does anyone not have it? Can also
I don't believe
pull
I
it
have
up.
it handy, but I don't. You don't have to go out of your way if it's just for me. It's fine.
Cool. It's in the Zulip, and I
Oh,
will
okay.
try to honor the break by actually taking it.
All right. Yep.
This
I'll try to
time.
find it
And
then.
I don't think it'll come up before then.
Okay.
All right. So if I remember correctly, last time we defined a measurable cardinal, what Badiou calls a complete cardinal. We began reflecting on it, and we had an intervention from Jim on Miss Ann's Blackbird. I think Chris and Jim, who've mentioned it in different ways, are definitely right that this time, if we're to put ourselves in a position to even take a temporary breath on this, we need to tackle the rather obscure concept of the index. At least it remains somewhat obscure to me, and perhaps we can collectively, I have a few ideas, but perhaps we can collectively puzzle out some more. So what is it about the index? I'll try to state in a preliminary way what puzzles me. You've all seen, of course, Badiou's diagram at the end of the book, which includes the index. He refers to it in the text as the index diagram. So obviously we should keep an eye on that. I'll answer with a diagram that just kind of expresses my questions and also reminds you of the Spinoza translation that can now be made pretty compact, no pun intended, at this point in the book. Did we do the substance attribute modes translation in a previous session? I don't quite recall.
Yeah, I think we did last time.
Okay. So we can be really quick about this then. Not with that pen. All right. So we know that V is supposed to be the absolute. And in the Spinozistic translation, it's playing the role of substance, right? And then we have an inner model M, which is not as inner as L, thank goodness. All of them include the ordinals, remember? And our inner models are supposed to be the attributes. It's a little bit unexpected because inner models sound like they would be things, but this is a very cool move. Identify the inner models with attributes. Almost goes without saying, infinite attributes of substance. Does substance have any attributes that aren't infinite in Spinoza? I don't know. Somebody has to tell me.
I think there are. I don't think there are non-infinite attributes, but there are other infinite things, right? There are the infinite modes as well. But, yeah.
Yes.
But they're not attributes.
So like
Right.
existence has to be an attribute of substance.
Yeah, and an infinite one, right? Okay, so next we have our infinite modes. So in order to get our attributes, right? We squeeze V into M, something a little more tractable. And as we've been discussing, there's an ordinal, which is also a cardinal, that we identify as the critical point of that embedding. As we squeeze, it moves up. It's John the Baptist. It testifies both to, it testifies to the absolute by means of testifying that it is not the absolute. It testifies to the Parmenidean immobile by moving. It's a lovely, lovely bit of dialectic there. All right, so K, which is usually, it's paradigmatic for it to be a measurable cardinal, or what he calls a complete cardinal, but it doesn't have to be. You can have a few things below and many, many things above that, as he talks about. But for the moment, K, our quote unquote complete cardinal, is an infinite mode. Okay. So we have a chain of mediators, I think. Here we are, stuck in the finite. We want to participate in the absolute. Well, we're not going to participate in V directly. We're going to participate in V by means of an infinite attribute, which is easier to get a handle on because it's defined not just absolutely as saying, well, remember what the cumulative hierarchy meant? We mean that. That's V, but M can be defined through this function that expresses some property. J, the squeezing function from V to M. All right. And how do we get access to the attributes? We get access to the attributes. They're made visible to us by this infinite modes moving. So the remaining question of mediation, I think, and the one that corresponds to the question of the index, is how do we make this third mediation to a fourth term? I don't think he actually says this, but it looks to me like a work and correlatively a finite fragment of a truth procedure, which is also what a subject used to be called, if I recall correctly. All of those things are, in their meaning, part of an infinite process. That's all very well, but in their being, they are, if I may put it this way, he says they're finite, and it looks like to me like they are finite modes, right? They are beings, which regarded in their being are finite. All right, so we have one more mediation necessary. We need to get the finite modes to participate in infinite modes. And I think this is what the index is supposed to do. So I think we're out here. We pour finite modes. The last mediation that we need is to get to a connection with paradigmatically a measurable cardinal, some large cardinal, that has some kind of necessity to it, despite the fact that we're talking about something much in transcendence of what apparently seems to be either beings in the world or the beings of the world in cardinality. And it looks like the index is kind of the mark that certain works or certain finite fragments of truth procedures have that points you along the way to their participation in the measurable cardinal or complete cardinal. I'm not satisfied that that means I understand it, though. To me, that sounds like a criterion. That's what it would be for, that's the functional role that an index has to fill. But I don't think I completely understand yet what an index or indexing is. Now, if we go to the Spinozistic analogy, some cases of this seem pretty easy. How do finite modes participate in infinite modes? Well, it's always tricky to remember what infinite modes are in Spinoza. As I recall, space and time are probably infinite modes. The world as a whole is an infinite mode. Force with a capital F is an infinite mode. Okay, whereas, and there, as Benji remarks, we have only one relation, causality, right? So the order of causality has to be the same across all of the attributes and within substance. All right, that makes it rather easy. If I have a finite system, say this room, which exists as matter and energy in space and time in nice relativistic ways that we don't have to unpack. If I want to formulate the laws of the universe from inside this room, there's going to be no way to do it that ends nicely at the boundary of this room, right? So the rational tracing of causality commits me to extending past the boundary of the finite mode that I've identified precisely in order to explain it, in order to make it rational. This looks to me, and again, I'm a Spinoza scholar, like a pretty easy way to show the necessity of a finite mode participating in an infinite mode. We can simply say that it's not a closed system. But
Could I ask a question, just a brief question?
yes, please.
I
And you
don't
don't
know
have to
if
frame
you
it in
have,
the form of a question.
I don't know if you have an opinion on this, but it always occurred to me that to the extent, I mean, I know Spinoza is not typically interested in sort of derivation, right? He doesn't give any sort of derivational story about his cosmology or whatever, but it always occurred to me that the list of attributes is going to have to be, looks like it's countable, right? Countably infinite. Whereas the infinite modes, it seems like you're only going to get them via diagonalization out of the countably infinite. Do you have a sort of, do you have any sort of view on that, or?
So there's for Spinoza and there's for us, right?
Yeah.
Of course, Spinoza doesn't have a
No,
distinction
he doesn't. No, he doesn't address
between the
it.
countable and the uncountable. And I don't know how much he makes of the distinction between the discrete and the continuous, which can be kind of a stand-in for that in earlier epochs. I would need a Spinoza scholar to tell me. But all right, for us, in the more positive appropriation of Spinoza.
I just mean, like,
in this book.
retrospectively, do you think that
Yeah.
story makes some sense, or?
Just to clarify first, are you saying the number that you think the number of infinite attributes has to be finite, has to be countable, or that the or that the attributes themselves in some way have to be countable?
No, I meant just the sheer number of attributes, just because they're I don't know what the proper term would be. I don't know, like they're unities or something, like they're not they're something like that.
What I recall, sorry.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
Well, what I recall is that he says we know about two of them. We humans are in a position to know about two attributes, right? Thought and extension. And beyond that, we know that infinite substance expresses itself in an infinite number of attributes. I would be surprised. I would be surprised if he didn't mean absolutely infinite in both cases, so that you got attributes of proper class size, but you also got proper class many of them. Why? Because without that, I'm just not sure why we would say that it's exhausted the power of the absolute.
Yeah.
But I'm not satisfied with that answer. I feel like I'm making it up, and also it intersects in a way that I don't fully understand with one of the more fascinating topics that Betty brings up here, that ambiguous zone, where the attributes as inner models, which is to say as indexed to large cardinals, in a way seem to run out and in a way do not. So on the in a way seem to run out angle, it might look like we're looking at only set many, whatever that set may be, only set many infinite attributes. I'm not completely convinced by the argument that they are kind of winding down just because we run into certain limits with the procedure of elementary embeddings. It's a very unsatisfactory answer, but does anybody else want to say something about that?
Just one. So if it's true that attributes are, so to speak, internally infinitely countable, and there are externally infinitely countable many of them, that still leaves us just at omega zero, correct? Like omega zero times omega zero is still omega zero cardinal.
Yeah, on that hypothesis, I see.
Right. Yeah.
I see why. I think I have a worry that is intertwined with yours. I don't know exactly how to translate between the one and the other, but in the physics example, right, extending the finite mode of the room to the infinite mode of the universe as a whole, there we really do seem to be dealing with a very simple infinite, right? Just the one that is present by taking the finite modes and deleting the boundary. Today, when we look at even the room as infinite in some respects, we could say those are infinites of the same cardinality. So that seems easier than what Badiou wants here, which is a mediation between finitude all the way to a measurable cardinal or a complete cardinal. And that's why I don't feel immediately satisfied with anything that just takes its cue from the Smithizist model and says, well, it's no problem, just treat it as, remember that you can't treat it as a closed system, and then you'll eventually get to an infinite mode. There has to be something else. And in particular, it seems to me, there has to be an increase in expressive power. At least this is my hypothesis. I think there has to be a certain level of expressive power that, even though it's expressed in a finite chain, serves to link that finite chain to not just a countably infinite chain, but to a large, maybe even very large cardinal. That's probably not clear yet, and I probably shouldn't try to say quite yet what I mean by expressive power.
Mind if I jump in here with a couple of thoughts?
Please.
So the spinozistic model, I think it's interesting. Throwaway line from Short Treatise on Ontology, the book Briefings on Existence. But you just as outright, Spinoza has no concept of the event. And maybe this is where we're losing the thread here, is that Spinoza just can't account for this, which is interesting for me. So if we take us to 451.
Can I interrupt for just a second there?
Yes.
The revaluation of Spinoza from the I mean, in the earlier works, Badiou was just beating him with a stick. Spinoza's closed ontology. Spinoza is hopeless there. I mean, that's why I was so surprised. I think a lot of us were at this attempt to pick up a non-standard model of Spinoza. Yeah, please go on.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. He definitely takes it to Spinoza quite a bit. So if we can turn to 451, this is the chapter 22. If I had to read this book over again, I would have started here and then worked backwards and then through the text, because I think this chapter is just really, really good at giving a lot of doctrinal summary of all the core concepts that are articulated, but mostly the payoff that comes with what this book is trying to tell us. So the bottom, that last paragraph, so this is where he gives a definition of index. Above it, talks about the work, about being fragments and dynamic. But on the bottom, he says, we will call this supplement of a finite work of truth, not counted in the enumeration of its elements, the index of the work. The index is actually the last evental trace marked on and in the work, the visible sign of the exception, both internal to the work and external to its finite being, extimate, as Lacan would have said. It should be understood that the index is inscribed in the finite work as a surplus trace, since it is not included in the finite counting of the elements of the work of a post-evental result. It thus shares the status of exception to the laws of the world that the truth procedure creates and is inscribed in the generic infinity towards which that procedure unfolds. So the reason I'm directing us to this passage, one is that we lose the spinocistic thread, but we can pick it up again with Lacan. Which is to say, for example, a lot of people's conception of the event is just things happen, and then out of things happening, the event does stuff. And it's really incoherent, and it makes Badiou look ridiculous if you're not actually key to what he's trying to tell us. So it's the same sense.
It makes the event look like a miracle rather than a particular kind of interaction between form and chance.
Exactly. And so this is the problem I have. It's the same thing with Lacan. It's, yeah, I made a flip of the tongue, but what does it really mean? Oh, let's talk about something else, right? If you don't follow up on the slip of the tongue when it's subjectivized and punctuated to you and the analytic discourse, then yeah, you're just going to lose it and not reconcile anything with what's going on, why you're actually having symptoms, why your symptoms are breaking down and you're losing enjoyment, et cetera, et cetera. So with Badiou, of course, right, there is an event, something is named in the situation, which is then accounted for by the encyclopedia. But beyond that, the truth procedure is what takes over. And he's very quite clearly on the next page, or maybe it's the top, sorry. Top of 451, it says, this is the basis of the event's singularity, and therefore also of its consequences, which constitute a truth procedure. So again, event happens, yes, but then what changed in the situation, what's evaluated as something different, is where, Badiou fleshes it out through Lacan, I think, this concept of truth procedure, its subjectivization, and why they're so closely related to one another, which is why you can't do a spinocistic analysis of this. What does everybody else think?
Let me recall one thing while we're processing that, and that's that in being an event, which we perhaps shouldn't just import wholesale here, the event has a particular form, right? So when we talk about it being exceptional with respect to the laws of the world, there's something very specific that he models that by in being an event, and that's a local suspension of the axiom of foundation. So we have an evental site, right? Call it S, which is made up of some stuff, etc. We know that foundation prohibits a set from belonging to itself. So the event, in being an event, is just, as I recall, the set S star, which consists of S and itself. Did I get that right?
I follow what you're saying, but yes, the general idea is that you have to decide on something that is undecidable from the standpoint of knowledge from the encyclopedia, because if you just go by what's already discernible in the situation, then the event doesn't take place because it's already named.
Yeah, now I remember his formula for it. It's E sub x is the set X, which is the site or the situation, and itself, E sub x, right? So it's what happens to the site when it borrows a kind of self-reference that in being an event he calls the hyper one, which I like very much. It borrows a kind of self-reference that is excluded from ontology, and therefore it has to disappear as soon as it appears. But you can work out the consequences of postulating this kind of self-reference in language that is not itself self-referential. And I just mean language in an ordinary sense. I mean an assemblage of stuff into a series. So we have an equation between the self-referential mapping of the event and a non-self-referential construction of a generic set. And the reason that we're able to see why those should be equivalent, I think, goes back to contrast diagonalization, which I probably don't need to.
John,
repeat again.
I think I feel like Logic of Worlds was an attempt to rectify the problems that being an event presented with this suspension of foundation for the event, right? That's how I sort of see it. It made it. It's like dynamics versus statics, and that's sort of that's what that book was about, largely, in my mind. Just to sort of add to the sort of historical where we get to today, right? With number 3.
So this is where I think the index is actually important to bring into the conversation, is that it's what he calls the last eventual trace. And we're literally losing the thread of something that's different, which has suspended the laws of the world, so to speak. And it's interesting that it's also the index of a work. So for me, let's just take as, I'm going to throw this out there because it's a thought in my head. We can say that there's a work still in play to, say, the Bolshevik Revolution. But the question is how is that indexed to the Bolshevik Revolution? Or is that sort of revolution already complete? It's already closed off and there's nothing more to be done with it as a work, so to speak. You know, is the debate Stalinism and versus Trotskyism still relevant today as an eventual trace that we need to flesh out through indexes and works? Or is it just something that's over and done with? And so for me, this idea of having a work that's indexed to an eventual trace is something that's sorely lacking in any type of political activism, so to speak, or at least it's sort of non-productive.
A couple of things I want to say to that, but Daniel's been waiting for a while.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. I mean, this is really the right question to be homing in on, I think. I mean, in some sense, you're dealing with ethics because the index, especially in politics, is about decision. And it's also about, I wish to say something, and it's interesting that Lacan comes into the play precisely because in the discussion on the Cultural Revolution towards the end of the text, Mao is referred to as the index of the Cultural Revolution. And what was the error of the Cultural Revolution was precisely when the followers of the Cultural Revolution mistreated the content of what Mao indexed. And they mistreated the content of what he indexed by not treating it as absolute thought, but rather as a personification of truth. So the idea
is that equivalent to saying that an index is supposed to be a pointer, and if you take a pointer for the thing that's being pointed at, then you have this problematic reification that ends with the proper name?
Yeah, I
That-
think
that-
so. I think
Because
so,
we
yeah.
have this
Similar,
surprising statement, in the politics section, right, that the political index is always a proper name.
Mhm.
And
it's
the
similar,
only way
it's
that
similar to the big debate that Lacanianism would usher into the picture, which has subsequently been passionately debated in the field of politics, around which everyone knows, if you know any Lacan, of his famous statement to the 68 anarchists that they secretly desire a new master. And all of the conversation of, okay, what then is a master for Lacan, right? Because a master is not what a master used to be. A master, Lacan says, is what puts signifiers to work for other subjects, right? It's not some, that's why the followers of Mao who like Lin Pao failed, because according to Badiou, Lin Pao actually literalized the index as a heroic version. So you see, it's very interesting because you have a new theory of mastery, which is egalitarian and which is not reliant on an individualist heroic model, at least in the field of politics, right? But then a lot of questions then emerge from there, because you could also say within, let's say, the truth of psychoanalysis, Freud is an index, whereas Jung, who's working with the same field of truths, is also a perversion or an obscuring of that index point. So there's also a question of the purity of the index, which is interesting to me. Yeah. And of course, the category of purity for Badiou is something that people would hold him accountable for, precisely because of his commitments to Maoism and its commitments to purism. So I also feel that the question of purity is bound up here with this new, well, of course, in Badiou's language, aristocratic egalitarian theory of the master. Aristocratic egalitarian. So there's much to think about here. Those are my initial thoughts.
I think you're alluding to some of the things I said at the beginning, Dan, with respect to that part of the work, right? Like no, darling, I'm just talking to this group. Sorry, guys. I feel as though I feel like that's the problem I was sort of alluding to, right? You can, if you're the index, everything that happens that's good is attributable to you, but you can defer anything that's bad, right? That doesn't seem to be, I don't know, it doesn't seem that makes sense to me as a justifiable construct.
Yeah. That, and also, I think in Bolshevism, it becomes more complex precisely because of the fact that Lenin is not the exclusive index. I can see the argument for Mao, but if you in fact study Bogdanov and Trotsky and other Bolshevik potential indexers, right? It's pretty obvious that at certain intervals, it was not solely Lenin as such.
Yeah, Lenin's not even there, right? He's hiding. He's on a train from Germany, right?
Exactly. So what is it about the on the one hand, this kind of movement away from Western individualized conceptions of mastery towards a collective theory of mastery, which is still reliant on the index, but there's still this complex ethical dynamic at work there that I'm not sure that he's sufficiently answered that for me in the field of politics. But I want to know what others think, honestly. I mean, we could read what he says precisely about how Mao, maybe that would be helpful. I'm here at 584, 585. And he's and some of these quotes might be useful for everyone if you haven't gotten to it yet. Because it's all about how militant subjects remain in proper relationship to the decision of the unfolding of events, and the and staying in a certain fidelity, I guess you could say, to the index of Mao Zedong's thought, but not in relationship to Mao Zedong as a cult figure. So Mao Zedong's thought is the guide for action in the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. So this means using what is potentially universal about a political thought to create and give order to what is being created. But this is not about, in an interesting way, and why the Cultural Revolution was halted, because it was idealized by thinking that it's about the transformation of souls or of the essence of the people involved, etc. Right? So I guess, has Badiou given us a better theory of the index in a political sequence? Because what he really says is that Robespierre, you know, Lenin, Mao, Toussaint Louverture in Haitian Revolution, these are our index figures. And I'm wondering if that still relies on a kind of a great man theory of history, or does it not?
It sounds a little like the Roman concept of dictator, doesn't it? Right? Like you're giving this person everything in terms of power and is above the law, and right. It sounds a little bit like that, but not finite in time.
So there's an interesting anecdote prior to the Great Leap Forward happening. Mao's visiting the countryside, talking with peasants. He makes the utterance, "Communes are good." And a reporter happened to overhear that, right, and took it and ran with it, and it became like this big, massive slogan, "Communes are good," right? So the utterance itself became different than what Mao perhaps intended. But it's that deification of Mao at the time, the prestige and that he had coming out of the Chinese Civil War, and being the hero of the revolution, that gave him sort of that extra bit of mastery over the situation, as it were, I guess. So there's a thought.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful, because I think in Badiou's work on politics, which is in his collaboration with Sylvain Lazarus, in the genealogy of Marxism, Leninism from 1848 up into 1968, right, for which that mode goes into a period of what they call saturation, right? Lazarus says that the novelty of the various index points from Marx and Engels in 1848 all the way up to the Shanghai Commune, that in fact we're in a different, what they call mode, right? In which political truths, I think, are no longer indexed to the same problematics, which is why in politics can be thought. I think Badiou opens up a completely new, if you like, I hate even saying this phrase, but post-Leninist conception of militant politics, perhaps. So I guess to go back to Chris's question, I'm not sure that the debates we see on social media, where people identify in a lineage of Stalinism, presupposing that name of index of Stalin still has any applicability to our current political problems, I don't think that Badiou would affirm that those names still do. There's a different extraction of insight, however, that we can gain from them. But I don't know that his claim is that we're in the same sequence that the Bolsheviks were. If we follow Lazarus, and I think Badiou does follow Lazarus in politics, and recognizes Lazarus as the most important political thinker in a post-Leninist period, such as we're in.
So would that make the Bolshevik Revolution an archive rather than a work? Because my understanding was a work is always valid or always open. There's always more that can be done with it. And if that is not true, then it ceases to be a work and becomes an archive. Or that maybe that's just an art?
This is what Lazarus calls saturation. So I think in that sense, yes. In that sense, yes, but that doesn't mean that those truths don't resurrect in new configurations, which is precisely why you have categories such as resurrection, and also why certain discoveries of the archive of different names of index, I don't know, interact with future political sequences. So what then is the relationship between an archive and a political sequence would be an interesting, I don't know, an interesting question. But yeah, that's very helpful. Yeah.
So yeah, archives, an interesting concept. I just want to maybe define it for everyone. 457, the very bottom, section 6, 2 cases of the index anti-finitude action can be clearly distinguished. The first case is strictly local. At a specific point in time, often at the time of the actual emergence of the work in a given world, the index functions as the resistance to the works being covered over by a constructible set. The local breaching of the imposition of finitude expresses the intrinsic infinity of the work for which a time seems suspended, since it is not subjected to covering between finitude and infinity. However, after this suspension has lasted a certain period of time, the static prevails over the dynamic, and the new constructible sets cover the work, consigning it to the status of what we will call an archive. The apparent vitality of the work between static and dynamic, between finitude and the freeing of its intrinsic infinity, was only a short-lived victory over the local powers of covering, an effect of the limited availability of constructible resources in the worldly place concerned. In other words, the work in question had only a short period of existence as a work. I'll pause there. One thing that's on my back of my mind right now is Walter Benjamin's thesis on the philosophy of history, where he talks about the idea that the Bolsheviks, in effect, saw themselves as the new Jacobins. The Jacobins saw themselves as reinstituting Roman law and order. So there's this kind of play of history on itself in that sense. I wonder if anybody else thought the same.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. Like one index renders a prior index an archive is how you could put it in Lazarus's language. Which is that 1917 only owed its strategic success to the fact that it was capable of pushing 1871 Paris Commune to a point of a further success. So you see there's a kind of strange post-structuralist political teleology going on there, which is really fascinating. And by the way, the current mode that Badiou and Lazarus call global capitalism of our time is the liberal parliamentary mode, right? Beyond the Leninist mode. So anyways, I don't want to get too derailed on this.
I don't necessarily think this is the moment for it, but I have one thing that's really tickling me at the moment that I want to add about the liberal parliamentary paradigm.
Please.
Yeah, okay, I'll just throw it in here semi-randomly. All right, so I learned a fact straight off of Wikipedia and then confirmed it in Peter Kellner's set theory course, and now I'm reading the original papers that talk about this because I'd like to write something up about it. I haven't yet. We know, of course, that what might seem like the most tenuous point to these mathematical reflections is their political application, right? And that's the one that tends to strike set theorists as most offensive or hubristic or something like that, which I think is a huge mistake. And I've been looking for hinges at which to defend those kinds of transitions. And it turns out that one of them is already there in the literature. Does anyone recall Arrow's theorem? I bet someone here does. Arrow's impossibility theorem, or as Arrow actually called it, Arrow's general possibility theorem.
This is in the poli-sci choices of democracy, or am I just way off?
I didn't hear the last phrase after
If
democracy.
it's the concept of you can only have so many choices before democracy breaks down. Maybe I'm off on the wrong.
Yeah, so it definitely has to do with a social choice function, and it has to do with the limitations of voting for selecting a social choice function on the basis of individual preferences in a way that strikes us as intuitively coherent. And this is not my field at all. I'm just going to briefly recall what I've heard. Basically, if you have an electoral system in its intuitive sense, produces rankings and what have you, you can't satisfy these three very natural properties in general. And Arrow stressed this, of course. That doesn't mean that everything breaks immediately, but in general, and this makes the difference to our concept of the thing at least, you can't satisfy all of these at once. If every voter says that X is better than Y, then the group as a whole should say that X is better than Y. And that should be stable in the sense that it should remain true, that ranking should remain true no matter how things change around it, as long as all the individuals continue to believe that this is better than that. And the third thing is no dictators. There does not exist one voter whose vote is the only one that matters. All right. And Arrow shows that quite generally, these seem to be pretty basic presuppositions of the logic of liberal parliamentarian democracy, maybe even kinds of direct democracy, probably also kinds of direct democracy, right? Yeah. And that you cannot in general satisfy all three at once. This is odd. But that's not what floored me the other day. That's just what Arrow's theorem is. What floored me the other day is that Arrow's theorem is actually equivalent to, provably, mathematically, the fact that every finite ultrafilter is principal. Remember this from the climactic point of the mathy sections, right, where Betty is telling us that a principal ultrafilter is of little use if we're going to clarify either ontology or forward some truth procedure at all, right? Because it remains captive to the singleton, to that particular form of the one, right? Which might be a dictator. conversely, if you allow a non-principal ultrafilter, as Badu keeps recommending, then you can escape Arrow's theorem, or escape is the wrong word. You can transcend Arrow's theorem through a passage to the infinite. Arrow's theorem no longer holds. The impossibility theorem no longer holds. If you pass to a non-principal ultrafilter, you can have all three of these nice things at the same time. Does that say anything about liberal democracy as it is in the finite? I think not. Rather, it points to the necessity of an infinitization of democracy, which would no longer look like liberal parliamentarianism, right? The cost of this is fascinating. And if I understand properly, this is why the social scientists don't seem to pay much attention to this result. They think of it as just a boundary result inside of which you can do interesting things. The first is that it makes necessary reference to the infinite. And they're like, oh, we can't do that. That's not relevant. There aren't an infinite number of voters. But the kinds of the gradual conceptual work that Badu is doing throughout this book should, I think, make us think twice about that. It might be difficult to say to them exactly in what the relevance of the infinite consists, but we have some hints, right? The infinite appears when we try to talk not only about the balance of interests, but about truth. The infinite appears when we try to talk not only about agents insofar as they mirror and internalize objective conditions, but insofar as they are subjectivized. The infinite occurs when, in some way, and I know it's a very un-Badusian word, but he uses it, when we're proceeding normatively and not just descriptively. So it's not a matter of this being useful for making a model of how liberal democracy actually functions, but it may be a model for talking about transcending it. The other cost, and then I'll pause here, the other cost, which again seems absolutely delightful to me, is that if I understand properly, you allow non-principal ultrafilter, right? It's, extremely intractable. It is no surprise that the social choice function that results as a matter of expressing something like the will of the people or the general will is uncomputable.
So, oh, sorry.
I remember it being an event, it's actually indiscernible. The general will is indiscernible.
I'm sorry. Yeah. But literally, as a result of this theorem, right? If you take the premises of Arrow's theorem, allow a non-principal ultrafilter, the social choice function, as rigorously defined, is now uncomputable. So again, I think the social scientists say, well, that's of no use except as a boundary condition, because they're thinking about something that can be instrumentalized, something that we or some technocrat or some politician can simply make use of, can operate like some sort of instrument.
Can I also throw something else in this conversation?
Sure.
John Rawls' veil of ignorance falls under this category too. Principal ultrafilter being, yeah, we could still have capitalism and private property, but as long as the worst of us are taken care of, we can still have infinite expansion and growth based on the set parameters of the veil of ignorance. And I forget the other stupid thing he has.
That's extremely interesting. I
This-
would like to hear more about that, especially if there's a way to formalize it. I don't know if that's been done, but I bet somebody's asked the question.
So the finite ultra filter principle is also another way for those of us to, well, precisely for us to reference Jacques Rancier's concept of the count, that liberal parliamentary democracy is ultimately only able to manage certain countable subjects, units, etc., but cannot include uncountable, exceptional emergences, eventual ruptures,
Yeah,
etc. Is
I-
that fair?
I think there's a lot, yeah, that is familiar to us in the political theory, both from Badiou and surrounding Badiou,
Mhm.
that is really convergent with this.
Mhm.
What excites me is that it provides this hinge for like the social choice people and the liberal parliamentarianism people, where they should have to acknowledge that a transition like this is possible, that there is relevance to this thought on two conditions. One is, as I mentioned, making the infinite relevant in the ways that we've talked about. And the other is making the uncomputable relevant, which again, I think is something that Badiou has been painstakingly teaching us for some time. If something like your general will here is uncomputable, yes, that means that neither as a technocrat, nor as a politician, nor as a dictator can you use it, can you deploy it as part of a rule of instrumental rationality. But as I think Badiou teaches us, there are other things that could be done. In particular, it could make use of you. And it could be a matter of our accepting in some fashion, to some degree, being made use of by it. This chiastic, this reversal between making use of something and having it make use of you. It keeps coming back to me as I read this book, and it's one theological figure that I think should be mentioned here that doesn't appear. That's obnoxious. I don't mean it should appear in the book, and it doesn't. I just mean there's a nice place for it here.
John, sorry, continue. Sorry, I thought you were done.
The theological figure being Augustine. So that reversal is the constant characteristic of Augustine's discourse, right? Just open the Meditations to a random page, and you'll have this. I think about you, my God. Wait a minute. I follow that out for a second. What does that actually mean? It means you think about me, and I acknowledge that. And of course, like Badiou, I'd say that gets dangerously theological unless it's properly rationally purged. But I think that reversal of perspective still applies. The closest. So the lesson of the big books writ large, I think, has something to do with this reversal of perspective. You do something with the computable, the uncomputable does something with you, but that's not nothing. You can learn to not just passively go along for the ride, but to become integrated in better ways with that process. The most explicit remark that I can think of in this book that speaks to this, and it isn't couched in terms of use, is the one that occurs at quote unquote the end of the discussion with the finitist skeptic. And there it's put in terms of showing, which I don't know if that's exactly the language that I would choose. But the point is that showing here isn't some sort of epiphany. That's not what's being attacked. What's being attacked is the showing of a fact that can then be laid hold of and put to instrumental uses, right? This is on 319. The finitist skeptic, the last exchange. I'm fed up, they abound, namely ultrafilters, and you can't even show me one. That's the way it always is with the axiom of choice. I'm going to come back to this in John's presentation in a few minutes. The thing exists, there are tons of them, but you can't show a single one. There are probably really easy ways to answer that, by the way. Most real numbers are indescribable, but if I describe one to you, I've clearly got the wrong one. Arguably, most natural numbers are boring. But if most natural numbers are boring, then there's a first boring natural number. And surely the property of being the first boring natural number is interesting. So again, in nicely Sartrean fashion, we have these ephemeral presences that exist to the extent that you can access them in peripheral vision, but you can't pull out a one of them. And Badiou's response here. That only proves that there's a major difference between what is and what can be shown. Show infinity, and I take that in my proposed translation to mean instrumentalize it. Hard to do. Think it, experience it, subjectivate it, create it, yes, 1,000 times yes. Down with the finitude of showing. If we stop thinking that thinking equals showing, that to be is to be able to be shown, we'll all be a lot better off. And I think we can say the same thing about acting, right? Which is not separate from thinking here in Badiou. If we stop supposing that to act requires the setup of instrumental rationality, we'll be a lot better off, because then maybe we'll allow the infinite to do something with us. John, I think.
Yeah, look, I just had 2 points on the impossibility theorem, and well, one on that and one on something else. One is, I think that, and this is me sort of, I have to creak open, there's some cobwebs in here. Well, I think Kenneth is one of my favorite economists. So the idea is, one of the biggest problems with it, I think, is the monotonicity, right? I think that modern economics sort of, the assumption of monotonicity that he makes, and lots of other things make in traditional classical economics, is actually the breaking point. And I'm not necessarily sure what follows without that. I know that they tried with, if I remember, like a Pareto optimal version. But again, I think, everyone being better off and no one being worse off is a hard thing to sort of, economically, like there's lots of counter examples to that. So those would be the two things where I don't know how it forms without that assumption. I would also say, if you're looking at Arrow, the other thing, just as an aside, completely unrelated, to look at maybe, given the nature of it in its infinity, is Arrow de Breu asset pricing, which is a really interesting means through which you price assets across time and infinite options across infinite time. So it's another place you may want to look into.
Thank you.
Aside.
Thank you, and I'd like to chat more with you about those because I'm not familiar with any of that stuff.
It's really fun.
So to maybe
Should we?
Just a quick maybe summation to steer this back into why Badiou is important for this discussion is when we take Arrow's theorem, something Daniel said, which was the count tries to manage, right? And this is one thing Badiou says that contemporary politics is about, it's about management. It's not about thinking of solutions that apply to everybody equally, and the idea that politics is possible, which, as I think about it, reading the last section of Immanence of Truths and going back to the preface of Logics of Worlds, where he's like distinguishing different subjectivities and different truths as they emerge in different conditions, this sort of comes full back to another conversation that was had, which was, well, what about the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution? What was the politics involved in that? That wasn't simply the management of the economy or whatever. And that's sort of the truth that Badiou says was, well, the truth of that happened was that you could make decisions that were politically motivated that took no understanding or concern for the economy. And so the idea being, and in fact, there's actually even a section in being an event 3, Immanence of Truths, where he talks about Mao saying, well, what's the point of nationalizing all the factories if they're just going to run like factories and do commodity production and nobody gets to decide anything. So for all these sort of efforts of management, what's dangerous to it is the actual idea that politics can happen as something that disrupts management. So
I wonder if we should honor the break here, take 10 minutes, reconvene. And there are a number of ways in which we can proceed. I have an awful lot more prepared, but I love how the free discussion is going. And if I don't wind up offering my major suggestions about the index, that's fine with me, all the better. We can make something supplementary or post them to the Zulip. I might throw out a few odds and ends that go with the theme of use and being made used of. And then perhaps we should shift to John's presentation, because I don't want that to be rushed, who's going to speak to us a little bit about the axiom of determinacy. And then we can probably come back to open discussion at that point. What do you think?
I think it sounds great. I think we should take 5 instead of 10, just so we maximize our time, if that's all right. I think.
Some people will want a cigarette. So
Fair enough.
Let's make it 10.
10 is fine.
And, all right.
We'll see y'all in 10. I'll set a timer right now.
Are we back on our heads?
30 seconds.
Is everybody familiar with that joke? I hope.
I'm not.
Back on our heads. It's something we say in the union I work in a lot of the times. Long story short, there's a guy, we'll call him a stagehand, dies, goes to hell. He's confronted with options by Satan where he has to pick a door where he's going to be eternally tortured forever. The first room, it's people being disemboweled, et cetera, very violent. And eventually he gets to a door where it's just a bunch of people standing waist deep in shit, drinking coffee. And Satan's like, pick the door you want. And of course, right, what does the guy say? Well, sure, I can drink coffee for all eternity, it's fine. And then Satan enters the room and says, yeah, breaks over, back on your heads.
But you get a break. It's like working at Denny's.
Yeah, which
I
is
will
why,
say,
again, we usually say when the break's over, hey, everyone, back on your heads,
I will say, I think I set the record for most nuggets eaten in the 10-minute interval.
All right. With your permission, I would like to attempt to do something completely impossible, so it'll be hilariously abbreviated. I would just like to share with you the sketch of an argument that I've been playing around with and would like to develop further, and that slightly pays the debt that I incurred at the beginning when I said that I was going to say something about strong logics in relation to large cardinals. I'm going to do this as fast as I humanly can. It won't be adequate. And then let's turn to John. Okay. So I was going to read all of these passages to you. There's no time for that. You will have noticed, I suspect, that every now and then Badiou says some seemingly very decisive things about, quote unquote, the language of set theory or the language of ZFC, which is the axioms plus first order logic, ordinary first order predicate logic. You recall this? And he takes a very conservative line on this. Why, when there are things that might seem to violate those strictures that seem so useful or relevant? Classic example, take the Geach-Kaplan sentence. Some critics admire only each other. I could say the same thing about, well, let's not go there. What is one saying there? One saying something that could be rather obviously irrelevant to everyday and political life, right? You're saying there exists a clique or there exists a cartel. Well, oddly enough, this is non-first orderizable. At least many have argued. Boulos argues against it. We can't go into all of that right now. The reason is that you're quantifying not only over ordinary objects, like the critics, but also properties of objects, which is how being a natural number is encoded here. You could try to flip to a two-typed distinction instead, as mathematicians would in practice. You could say we have one kind of thing which are critics and one kind of thing which are numbers, but take my word for it at the moment that it doesn't make the systematic problem go away. Okay. Something at least minimally non-first orderizable. The line that Badiou takes is ironically very close to Quine's. Quine famously says that higher order logic is set theory in sheep's clothing. So the implicit argument here is, well, we can't use higher order logic to help us expound our set theory, because in order to know what our higher order logic means, we have to already understand some set theory. In particular, whenever I want to quantify at the second order, whenever I want to quantify over quote unquote properties or relations rather than over individual terms, Well, the possible extensions of properties are subsets, right? Possible extensions in a given set of properties are subsets. Which ones? And we're back to the problem of the power set. We want to say intuitively all of them. We want to consider all of the subsets as possible objects of knowledge. But we've already seen that that requires, in its naive version, that's inconsistent, and it requires coming to the aid of this idea of the power set over and over again. Plenty of objections and responses to be made there, but that's roughly the Quinean line, which I think that you largely accepts for why you should keep your logic to first order logic plus axioms. And I am not at all contesting that one should begin that way. That's the great virtue of it. It makes it possible to begin. But one could slide into thinking that that's the only legitimate way to speak, or that only on those conditions does one know what one is talking about, or something like that. Contrast the point of view of Gödel. In a remark to Hao Wang in 1976. (1971) first. Gödel remarks, in contrast to set theory, predicate logic, first order logic as we've been discussing, is mainly a matter of rules of inference. It is unnatural to use axioms in it. For the infinite mind, the axioms of set theory are also rules of inference. Gödel again in 1976. Lower functional calculus, predicate logic, consists of rules of inference. It is not natural to use axioms. It is logic for the finite mind. But we can also add logical constants such as many, most, some, in the sense of plurality, necessarily, and so on. For the infinite mind, axioms of set theory are also rules of inference. Now, if you find yourself on the side of Quine rather than Gödel, it's a sign that something has gone wrong. Just back away slowly, reconsider your position. But no, seriously, what seems crazy about Gödel's position is this idea of an infinite mind, right? That could be in control of what's going on in second order logic. It's that agent-centered, knowledge-centered, instrumentality-centered position that's built in to the received idea of a mind that is actually the problem. So we can make the same kind of reversal, I think, if we look to Badiou on use that we made regarding the infinite itself a few minutes ago, right? If we say it's not a matter of a mind having, say, second order logic as an instrument, it's a matter of a subject being willing to undertake with all of the uncertainty that entails, being willing to accept that something is being done to it that can be described at a second order level. Moreover, I think that actually helps us understand what Badiou explicitly calls for in this text, especially at that culminating moment that I pointed out last time, where he calls for us to promote the ultra filter to the level of a philosophical concept, not just something we think about, but something that we think with. Well, if we supplement our large cardinal talk with strong logic talk, it becomes, I think, actually a lot easier and more elegant to see how we can do this. What would it mean to use these as philosophical concepts? And there are some symptoms, I think, I'm blowing through far too quickly, but so be it. There are some symptoms, I think, of points at which the text kind of stalls for lack of that. I follow, without them being remotely responsible for the kind of thing that I would say, I follow Bagaria and Van Innen and Magador and set theorists of that kind who are working on projects that coordinate large cardinals and strong logics. So that, to me, what Badiou is giving us here is like 1/2 of the Rosetta Stone to see to see what these things are, we might as well avail ourselves of the translation once we no longer have that Quinean worry about use and mastery. But it's Badiou himself who teaches us not to have this worry, right? We would have that worry if it prevented us from getting started, but that's what good old first order logic is good for, getting started. It doesn't mean we can't pick them up again. And there's some symptoms, I think, where the text stalls a little bit for lack of an approach like this. I'll just mention two of them. You'll have noticed in these later chapters after complete or measurable cardinals have come up, that we start having repeated mentions of the reflection principle, and even one brief discussion that probably leaves people mystified about consistency strength. These are all things that require strong logics to talk about. And I'm going to say it one more time. I'm radically with Badiou. Math is the real logic. There is no logicism or logicizing to be had here. The exploration of logics is just the means by which we can see elegantly how math is the real logic. So I just had to make that disclaimer once more. The reflection principle is, Zach.
I just wanted just terminology. What do you mean by strong logics exactly? Yeah, just any logic that's stronger than first order predicate calculus, or what do you mean?
Yeah, as far as I know, there are essentially three things that strong logics can mean, and I've only talked about the higher order case because we don't really have time. I take this from a tutorial by Van Inen, I think. One is higher order. So instead of just saying for all X, there exists a Y, etc., we can say things like for all properties, there exists an object. The second is generalized quantifiers. Which may be one of the things that Gödel was just alluding to at incredible speed in that remark to Wang. So generalized quantifiers, rather than only talking about all or one, we can talk about number somewhere in between. And the more you ascend the ladder of the infinite and allow yourself to talk about number in more and more cardinally interesting senses, the stronger your generalized quantifiers are going to become, and the more you depart from first order logic quite naturally. And the third is infinitary logics per se. And there, the way of exceeding first order logic is by allowing yourself infinite strings of certain sorts in your expressions, and not just finite strings. All of this has one thing in common, namely it realizes that thinking is caught up in the fugue of the use and dimension of number. Whereas when we retreat to the safe ground, familiar predicate logic only, plus axioms, yes, the axioms are doing the real work for us, but the first order logic can be misleading, and the classic result, some of you will know Lowenheim's Golem, the classic result is Lindström's theorem, which says first order logic in its familiar sense is characterized. This is a necessary and sufficient condition for being a first order logic. It is characterized by the fact that if you allow it to talk about the infinite at all, it can no longer draw any distinctions. So first order logic is characterized by the fact that if a first order theory has any infinite model at all, it has models of all infinite cardinality. So that's the content of the upward and downward Löwenheim-Skolem theorems. And what Lindstrom adds is that this is the essence of being first order. So I would put it this way.
Is that the same as so is that the same as the property of categoricity? So logics of infinite order, logics with infinite size models cannot be categorical according to their cardinality.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah,
And another way of putting it that sounds equivalent is to say that their theories cannot be absolute in the sense that that Badiou is interested in, right? Rather than being sure that they are referring to the absolute referent V, we don't necessarily know what they're referring to. And that's something that first order logic is characterized by, but excludes a sort of self-consciousness of, right? It pushes it to the model theory. It says to the model theorist, you go and worry about that. I still have a perfectly good instrumental system. Whereas taking up the sort of dialectical imperative of strong logics, one might say, we're not going to play that. We're not going to play that game. The proof theory and the model theory are never identical, but they're not separable either. And you can't push all of these problems about being unsure of what we mean once we decide to mean something non-trivial about number. You can't push them all to the edge and give them to somebody else, the model theorist. Okay, so just 2 more steps in this, and then we really need to get to John. My suggestion is going to be, and you can elaborate on this later and elsewhere, that we may be able to shed some kind of light on the index, or of that first step of participation between finite and infinite modes, by paying attention to these stronger logics. Because if you write something to make the case as simplistic as possible, if you write something down in a higher order logic, for the most part, leave out infinitary logics for a moment, you've still got a finite string. And if it succeeds in referring non-trivially to the infinite, then this may be a hinge, I think.
John, did you read the Zalamella book? Did you mention that at the beginning of the list?
At the beginning of the...
your discussion as one of the people that you were influenced by on this? Zalamella?
Oh, no, I didn't. Does he talk about this?
Yeah, I mean, his book's called Synthetic Philosophy of Modern Mathematics, and he's talking. Yeah, it's Grothendieck set up into movements and all of this sort of where I guess contemporary mathematics gets you. And I'm in agreement with you, and I sort of allude to that at the end of what I'm talking about. But the math just gets way beyond my understanding at that point. So.
Well, mine too, but I thought of him as more of a militant category theory is better kind of person. Is that a mistake?
That may be. This is not. I think this is more of a what's it called? Like it just gives you all the analysis of different options, basically.
Okay, I need to go back to that text. I've read it, but I clearly have no memory of it. All right,
it wasn't the easiest text to read. Yeah.
Yeah, really. Great translation, though. Right, so that's my suggestion about the index. I'm going to develop it later. And my last remark is to defend myself against a hypothetical interlocutor. You guys are too polite to say this, but presumably you're like, you just made all of that stuff up, Bova. You're telling us that we need being in event 4, which is about strong logics. And in a certain sense, that's true. But this is the point I would like to end on as far as my contribution goes. There was a point at which, before he got quite so conservative, I obviously don't mean politically, there was a point at which it seems to me Badiou saw the possibility for what he was doing of non-first order isabilia, things that cannot be first orderized. And that's in the torsion section. We don't have time to read it all together. Let me try to find something that can be quoted. 149, torsion designates the subject point from which the other three classic determinations of truth come to be coordinated: totality, coherence, and repetition. Okay, fine. Torsion here interrupts repetition in the sense that you keep adding an element to itself. And whereas in a non-torsion group, you're never going to suddenly get back to zero. In a torsion group, you might collapse at some point. It's like going around a clock. You wind up back at zero. And his argument here for the philosophical significance of this consists in the fact, which he lays out, that the theory of torsion groups is non-first orderizable. And it's so for exactly the same reason that we mentioned with regard to Geach Kaplan. When you have ordinary objects, but you're also trying to talk about numbers, you wind up quantifying over properties of the ordinary objects. 152. In contrast, the existential that the theory of torsion runs up against, figure of the aleatory nature of the interruptions, the indeterminacy in any rupture, exceeds the logical plane where the universal could hold up. Finite groups, incidentally, are all torsion groups, which I think makes for a very nice reversal of the expected relation between the finite and the first orderizable. So this interruption by torsion is one of the first paradigms of the event. And here, rather than it being in terms of the logic of self-reference or any of the other characterizations that succeeded, here it is in terms of non-first orderizability. And of course, I can't help cutesily pointing out that the name under which Daniel has assembled us this whole time, whether it be on Twitter or on the Patreon, is torsion groups. So we've ended by naming the place, which will hopefully indicate that something has happened. Daniel?
Oh, that's great. No, that's fabulous. So, yeah, it's a theory of the subject reference, which is a long story, but I don't want to, we have been going for 1 hour and 50 minutes. And now it's John's turn. We're very excited.
Yeah, we have to turn to John.
Yeah.
And let's end there.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, we'll have some sort of concluding remarks after John's talk, and then we can say good night.
Great.
Take it away, John.
Great.
I'll make you co-host.
Thank you, and I'll share my screen. Feel free to jump in at will, and we may have some comments from the peanut gallery on my side because I've got a couple of my little ones with me, so that will be interesting. Let me share my screen. I have 4 slides, just to contextualize how I'm doing this, and as a non-professional, I don't think I'll have the grace and poise of John, so please excuse me for that. I wanted to talk about something that I've been looking into, I guess, for some time, since around 2013, when I think Logic at Harvard did the expanding the frontiers of infinity. I think the I was in it, from the group at Harvard. Incompleteness, sorry, yes. And they put a whole bunch of documents up on the internet, which was really useful. I found, at least as a further area of study into the higher infinite, something which I don't think I would have otherwise had the chance to look at. And from that, it led to some of these points with respect to Baidu, sort of waiting for a couple of years as my French, I got 3% in French at school. So I had to wait for the English translation of this book to sort of hope he was getting in the direction I thought things were going. And I think he gets some of the way to where I would have hoped him to get, but I think there's some failings, which I wanted to talk a little bit about. and in the direction, and the direction of that is, I think, in terms of determinacy. So we can talk about that. This is just the setup, which I think we're all hopefully familiar with. Assume math equals ontology as in being an event. Let's start with that and hold true to that at this point. I think one of his self-professed failings, at the beginning of this book, is his dismissal of large cardinals, which he described as fictions in being an event at one point. And a large reason being that that a lot of the important work to come, I think, in large cardinals, to be honest, was done at, around, or after the writing of being an event, and has continued to flourish, beyond logic of worlds. So, to be fair to him, I think pleading ignorance to some degree is valid, and I think he does realize that it needs further exposition, and that's what he's doing in this book. I think it's made inroads into correcting that, but I think that it's somewhat insufficient in his coverage of large cardinals. And this is the reason, really. He doesn't talk about axioms of determinacy, not just the axiom of determinacy, AD, but more general or higher order ones, which given equivalences between various large cardinal axioms and determinacy axioms leaves, I think, this analysis incomplete. If something's equivalent to another, you may want to address both sides to ensure that what you're trying to translate from mathematics to ontology makes sense in both explanations.
So John, if I may, this is a third column, right? Large cardinals, strong logics, determinacy.
Yes,
we've got a full Rosetta Stone.
I hope so, but I think it creates a couple of problems, and we'll get to that.
Okay.
So the structure of determinacy axioms are game theoretical in nature, and I guess one of the negatives of my mathematical past is that I didn't do a lot of, like I was saying, crazy modern pure math, but I did luckily do a lot of game theory in other courses I did, so I understand that at least. And potentially, I think some of the impacts of this nature of determinacy axioms has ontological consequences and brings into assertions, some of his assertions, or it means that we need to move into something like a higher logic. Sorry, I pushed the wrong button there. So this is coming directly from Colliner. I think that this is a really good paper to read as a primer. There's a couple of them actually. This is the one I'm referring to largely when I'm talking in some of these things. So, and this is the conclusion. There's a lot of math to get to these points done by some of the leading people in contemporary set theory. So I won't try and run through how you get to these equivalences. I think it's beyond my scope, and probably beyond, and definitely beyond the scope of what we're talking about here in the interval that we have. But to conclude what he says, large cardinal axioms are sufficient to prove definable determinacy, and inner models of large cardinal axioms are necessary to prove definable determinacy. In fact, through a series of deep results, these two conceptually distinct approaches to new axioms are ultimately seen to be at root equivalent. So just before, and then here's some examples. But to explain what's going on here really quickly, if you think back about what a large cardinal axiom is, it's trying to supplant or enhance the axiom of infinity to some degree, right? By saying there exists a level of infinity that is this level or this cardinality. An alternative instead of having, and within its ZFC, an alternative that was proposed earlier was, as we've talked about, V equals L as an assumption, right? Which is I guess a similar shape and form. Gödel, I don't think, Gödel in further lectures beyond those proofs talked about how large cardinal axioms are probably the way to break beyond V equals L. And so I think it was his hope that that was the methodology. But there are others, right? One is to remove the axiom of choice and replace it with the axiom of determinacy. And to quickly, the implications of that were to replace choice with something else, which allows for, I think it's the general continuum hypothesis, John, correct me if I'm wrong, as opposed to just the continuum hypothesis to be held as true, as well as a bunch of other things, but then it creates further problems in math. So choice has been the axiom that mathematicians have generally lent on instead of determinacy. But we're at an order of magnitude in the hierarchy higher than that at present. And so I think that's sort of what I wanted to talk a little bit about here, because things like as Colliner points out in that article, in that paper, other forms of determinacy based on different structures of the game are consistent with ZFC, and also lead to some of these other conclusions, which in terms of the existence of other cardinals, they're equivalent to those. So it's a toolkit which is useful in its construction. What is the determining axiom? I think that's important just for us to go over for those who haven't seen what it looks like. And this is the original form, right? By I think they're Polish mathematicians, so pretty early on in this process. And you're basically saying for a set of reals, consider the game where two players take turns playing the natural numbers, right? So there's the example of player 1 and player 2. And at the end of this game, the two players will have produced a real X obtained through interleaving their plays. We say that player 1 wins the round if here, otherwise player 2 wins the round. And the set A is said to be determined if one of the players has a winning strategy in the associated game. That is a strategy which ensures that the player wins a round regardless of how the other players play. And the axiom that follows is that the statement that every set of reals is determined. And that's I succinct a definition of, I think, how you get to the axiom of determinacy that you can get. Projective determinacy is similar. Just to refer back to what I was highlighting here as one of the examples in Theorem 4.5. It's saying that it's the same game, but with perfect information of length W. AD in LR is AD for sets within LR, which again is in 4.6. There are other forms of determinacy, but they're generally, in the general form, they're taking this structure, right? And you're making some assumptions, right? Which is, in the case of two-player infinite games, such as these, you're making the assumption of two players, whatever that means, a winning strategy, natural numbers, which I think we can get from somewhere else in ZFC, and the structure of whatever, and play, right? So you're making some assumptions a priori of this axiom in order to flesh it out. I think there's some implications from this, right? The first is large cardinal axioms generally have equivalence to determinacy axioms. I think that's the first one. I think we can take that, if we take that as given the math, we can't ignore away those equivalences, I think, if the math is sound and if math equals ontology. So on the surface, their structure and all the game theoretic structures I've ever seen, single player games, single player finite games, three player game, there's a long list. They're making statements about who's playing the game, the state of the game, the structure of the game, the rules, right? How you play it. And so this poses a problem for me ontologically, right? We're making ontological statements about existence of things, namely players and games and strategies, prior to fleshing out the rest of the ontology, if we're accepting it as an axiom. And so I guess there's a couple of solutions, right? I think John has highlighted one of the clearest ones, which is you need higher order logics in order to flesh some of these things out. The second alternative, which I put here really quickly, is to advocate for axioms below the level of determinacy equivalence, right? And sorry about the spelling through this. I wrote this up quite quickly. But one of the major problems with that is that Hadrington's theorem, which is proved by Samy 99, shows that sigma 1-1 Turing determinacy. Sorry about that. Again, the notation here is poor, but it implies the existence of zero hash, which is the level just above V equals L. So if we're going to have no determinacy, and I think we have to be at V equals L or lower, which I don't think is where we want to be, or Baidu definitely doesn't want to be. So we're going to need something else. And so I also think, so my view is that without explaining those or explaining them away or discussing them, Baidu is missing a core part of the philosophy. So I think it begs the question about how you resolve some of these issues about players and games and strategies because of their equivalence to what he wants to include. And there's probably other ways to get around it, but the two I think are probably either you have to go up an order of logic or something like that. John presented two other options, or you have to go below to back to V equals L, which changes the philosophy dramatically. I think I'll stop there, and I don't know if there's questions or comments or.
I've got some, but I would like to give anyone else a chance to go first while the presentation is fresh in their mind.
Two things struck me. One is the kind of claim that Badiou just sort of glosses over large cardinals, but I'm questioning whether that's methodological on Badiou's part, because what he's effectively doing with the infinite in this book is pulling the sort of philosophical understandings that have been at play for centuries and centuries, such as infinity is what resists division, infinity is what's the most the four infinites that he basically articulates and uses. So there's that aspect. And then the question also, I'm pulling this from 508 and Immanence of Truths, but he says, first, in being an event, and again, at the beginning of this book, I suggested a key reason for this. I'm not sure what this does at this point, but which I am tirelessly repeating here. What mathematics grasps as its real is nothing less than all the possible forms of the multiple. Now, being qua being is nothing but multiplicity, which is not to say math in this case. The math equals ontology, I think, is always a caveat of understanding. But that being qua being is nothing but a multiplicity. It is possible even beneath all the four possible forms it can take. Multiplicity as such, inconsistent and ubiquitous, but all knowledge, in this case scientific and unable to be anything else, of this total multiplicity is through the multiple form that manifests it, forms of which mathematics is the universal inscription. And so I guess the question, this is the second sort of question I have is, yes, okay, if you're supposing that game theory has to have something to say in the realm of ontology, then what is it? What's the science of the real we're touching on here?
Let me start with the first one. I think he acknowledges large cardinals, but what I'm trying to say is I think there's a justification for ignoring it and being an event, which is ignorance insofar as that it wasn't even math yet, right? That's fine. But the math, I think, at this point that I was talking about is in the lexicon and is available, and I think he would be aware of it because a large part of it's in the books he's referencing. And so my critique is that we can replace any of those axioms of large cardinals that we want to talk about with a determinacy axiom, and it's the same thing. And then the philosophy has to meet the standards of that axiom in the same manner and the same form it does, under it being the assumption that there is a Ramsey cardinal, or whatever, which one you want to take. There is zero hash limits, or you have to get to that level. And I think to ignore it with these problems, I think ontologically in what the game theory construction of determinacy axiom says, is that's the hard thing. How do you, like when we're talking about the one and the other and multiplicities, and then we're assuming that there are two things and they're playing this infinite game, how do you square that circle of assuming those in the axiom and then leading to the conclusions that come out of these books?
Can I jump in with something that could you mute yourself for just a second?
Yes, of course. Sorry.
Oh, no, not you, John. Other John. His microphone is picking up my voice because we're in the same room. That line that Chris just read. So I'm shamelessly stealing from stuff that I've talked about with John Boba before. So I apologize if I've anticipated something he wanted to say. Right, Badiou many times in this book, and I'm probably in other books, although this is the only one I've read from beginning to end, repeatedly characterizes mathematics as the study of the possible forms of being. But he almost always means by mathematics ZFC set theory, right? And I think one of the things that's so interesting about these determinacy axioms that John Dance was just bringing up, right? Mathematics itself has multiple forms, right? So Badiou is pretty committed to choice. But what if we didn't go that route and we did ZF set theory plus these other axioms, right? And so you end up in the same place a lot of the times, right? We've just been told certain axioms of determinacy are equivalent to large cardinal axioms. But if we're really committed to a thorough thinking of multiplicity, don't we have to think the multiplicity of the thinking of multiplicity?
Yeah, I think so. And one of the scary things, right, that this alludes to is, like, let's just say we went back down to assuming axiom like AD, right, without all the higher infinite, or any of these other ones, and we're assuming some set of two players in an infinite game, right? That sounds to me pretty manichaeistic, right? Like, you know, it sounds like Zoroastrianism or something like that, right, in its structure. And maybe that's what he fears it leads to. And you know, and I fear the same thing. But I think it's something that we need to confront, given that these equivalences are obvious now in the math, right. And so I had high hopes that this was something in this book he was going to tackle before it was published, and it being published, it wasn't addressed. I think it leaves the door open to this being a criticism of the setup, you know, unless we move up a level or we go down and fix it at something like V equals L.
Thank you so much for that, John. That was great. Do you mind if I throw a few things at you in response? Okay. So first, to Dresden's point, I thought that was perfect. I think we can not formalize, but mount a dialectical argument to the effect that it is proper to the multiple to appear multiple ways, even in mathematics, maybe even and especially in mathematics, where you wouldn't necessarily have then an Uber theory that explains how all of these multiple ways are exactly the same. That I don't think happens, because then the multiple wouldn't be reappearing in actually multiple ways. It would still be captured. Right. So you clarified with Chris that you were talking about being an event. In the line that Chris read, I love the probably there. It's so indicative of the slightly relaxed tone of this book. V is probably inconsistent multiplicity, as opposed to the strong statement in being an event. Being is inconsistent multiplicity, and then we have problems about how to finesse the relationship between that and sets. One other thing to Chris, the game theoretic framework does sound extremely artificial and weird at first, at least to me. There are some quick translations that can help make it, I think, suddenly much more intuitive. Hinticke is good for this, puts it in terms of Kantian categories, but one can do it in terms of Lacanian categories as well. Rather than thinking of player one and player two as symmetric, you can think of player one perhaps as the subject who is trying to stabilize their position in relation to the other via knowledge, and player two in terms of the other, or perhaps even the real, actively devoted to frustrating diagonalizing out of those attempts to coordinate the relation in terms of knowledge. I didn't put that very well, but there's a lot to be
John,
done there.
there's also a couple of good, I haven't looked at them in years, but there's a couple of good YouTube videos I remember finding at some point where a game theorist explains how an infinite game works and gives you like the examples and runs you through the structure of how these things actually operate, which is probably really useful to watch if you haven't ever seen anything like this before.
Yeah, let's post that, and let's also post I'll put in the shared Google folder. I 100% agree with you that Kellner's SEP article, Large Cardinals and Determinacy, is wonderful. In fact, that's what I'm going to lean on in all of my subsequent remarks. But Zach first.
Yeah, I just had a. I'm sorry, I didn't really understand much of your presentation, John. So it's a bit beyond me. But I just had a just picking up on Dresden's point, which I thought was interesting. If that's the conclusion that one would ultimately have to draw, something like thinking multiplicity is also a multiplicity of thinking. I'm just if that were the conclusion that one had to draw by virtue of these, at least equally tenable axiomatizations and so on. I'm just what would that's interesting, but perhaps also that would be interesting, but also concerning, because it seems like it would start to sound a lot like Derridianese, right? So it seems like one of the it seems to me that one of the virtues of just as it strikes me, just as a kind of non-expert, but one of the virtues of mathematical approaches in philosophy of the kind that Badiou undertakes is that we find some kind of middle space. I guess this idea of math as the middle space goes back to Plato too, right? So it's like we find a way of talking about things which in a discursive register would just have to appear as metaphorical, or when we talk about the infinite just in a discursive register rather than in a mathematical register, we have to resort to metaphor or rather inexact concepts. But if the upshot of all of this was finally that thinking multiplicity is just the multiplicity of thinking, then it seems like we would be back in a sort of in a kind of how can I put it kindly? I don't know, this sort of the somewhat skeptical registers of post-structuralism that don't find an exact formulation for concepts like difference, infinity, repetition, all the stuff that we think might find a better representation in mathematical terms. I don't know. That's just a thought.
Zach, I think that's a really good point. I guess the third path, which I didn't say, is the alternative could be, instead of having to create some completeness across all of these things, is choose your math, choose your ontology, right? I'm sure someone like the Pope's really going to want some sort of axiom with determinacy in there to give good and evil a name, and and go from there. And someone else can have something else. But then I think it's the same problem that you're talking about.
We have.
Yes, I mean some people might view that as a benefit, right? Just sort of like mathematical pluralism, and therefore whatever follows from that. But it seems to me that at that point, you sort of, at the cost of that is to give up perhaps some of the prima facie benefits that mathematical philosophy had in the first place. I don't know, as a way out of sort of problems that might otherwise appear intractable. I don't know.
So what's interesting
we have
here,
been at that.
just the one thing, I guess it's 2 points. One is, if you remember the discussion in the works on science of the index, mathematics has a unique actual trait, which is that it has no index, or it doesn't need to be indexed at all. It just goes straight to the heart of being, which I think was interesting. But then again, this sort of question that always comes up of why does Badiou say mathematics is ontology? Again, we start with multiple. What thinks multiplicity best? It's a set of sets of sets of sets, which is again why we're not Deleuzians, maybe, because we don't think calculus is what gives us being, or we're not doing geometry and doing maybe a spinicistic model of being in that respects. So I think there is a certain point of choose your own math and then come what may, but you're responsible for what comes after the fact. What you're committed to.
A couple of points about pluralism and relativism. First, I at least wouldn't accept immediately that a multiple thinking of the multiple is just a set theoretic relativism or set theoretic pluralism. I would think about the different ways, for example, the three that I mentioned, and now we have determinacy axioms and what have you, in which a more ambitious thought of the multiple tends to break out of first order ZFC. That doesn't tell us anything about pluralism or relativism yet. And we have been at this point before, right? When Cohen first established, famously, building on Gödel's other side, the independence of the continuum hypothesis via forcing. There was an immediate sense there too that maybe we should just throw up our hands, abandon realism about sets, and say, well, we can do whatever we want at this point. But in the decades afterwards, as I understand it, that became a less appealing reaction because we discovered more structure to what initially seemed like that free play of forcing. And it would not surprise me at all if that happens again. But I will acknowledge that Hampkins, who ought to know, noted set theoretic pluralist, the kind of person you would want to engage in writing B in event 4, actually states that we're in a philosophical crisis now regarding set theoretic pluralism and set theoretic relativism, which if that's true, how wonderful, right? It would be like being transported back to the 1920s and 30s when we get to have a proper foundations crisis in mathematics, which is the most fertile thing that can ever happen for philosophy. That would be wonderful if that's true. I can take over as host if anybody needs. Daniel, if you need to go, I'd like to just add a few points in response to what John said, and then I can cut it off if you'd like.
Your intuition is correct. I do have to do dinner for the kids. I'm saying goodbye. I just want to thank everyone for this dedication. I think the videos, all 6 of them, will live in infinity on YouTube, unless Elon Musk takes over YouTube, of course.
The archive. It's the archive.
Yeah. So just, I think we should all just thank John Bova for his effort. It was exceptional and very, I think, a resource that will be invaluable to the Badgesian community moving forward. And I will say it would be nice if you all agree at some point to continue to try to bring Badju into more layman discourses. So I was thinking that it might be interesting to have a couple people onto like a podcast where we talk about the text and continue to elucidate some of these extremely difficult things. So that's one thing I want to do as a educational offering in the future, and maybe John would be so inclined as to join us for such a conversation. But with that, I got to bounce, and thanks again, John.
Thanks so much, Daniel, and for convening us to begin with.
Yep.
And for your kind words, and enjoy dinner.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye. All right. Just a little farther with John's presentation, if I may. First question, it's kind of a softball. John, would you be willing to take the line more like the one that I've been taking, that this isn't actually a critique of the text, but a means of coming to the aid of the text, that we can do more philosophical work to come to the aid of this project by looking at these other formulations? Do you blame him for leaving this out, or are you excited to reinforce this project?
I wish he had attacked it, insofar as that I find it difficult to craft the right ontological statements to get you to a level of meaning that he's able to do. So I'd love to have seen him do it. And related to that, you know, I unlike in the first book, I don't think he could deny that he has seen this part of the math, right? It's almost impossible for him to do that in 2018 when he wrote this. So I don't know if it feels like a turning away from it or an exclusion, which I think lowers some of the credence he gives to the concept of the absolute.
All right, I'm going to stick to the positive version for now for myself. That these are things that call for our aid and supplementation, but I do take the point that
he can answer that. He could answer that, right? So, I think.
All right, let me try and get into slightly more substantive stuff. First, will you tell me if I have the rough picture of the history roughly correct with respect to determinacy? So I think at first there's this fully general notion of determinacy, right? And that quickly becomes dysfunctional. It's easy to show that that fails. So then we have relatively cautious.
Well, I think it's easy to show. Sorry, John. I think it's easy to show that it's incompatible with the axiom of choice. Right? There is still set theories in which it operates.
Yeah,
but it's incompatible with the logic of choice.
Yeah, and at first that was experienced as a problem, right? So then we got cautious and restricted ideas of determinacy, and then they started expanding again to get more and more general, and now this time maybe with eyes open, considering it as just a full-blooded alternative to choice. So it's hard to not just wind up with a duel of intuitions here. I would like to see a good ontological argument, and maybe it would depend on making reality more interactive in a game semantics kind of way. That would be interesting. I would like to see a more ontological argument that convinces me to give up the full power set. Or alternatively, that convinces me to give up the.
I should say, I apologize if I didn't make this clear, but higher level determinacies like projective determinacy are compatible with ZFC.
Yes. Yes. So that's a restricted version again, right? Which is compatible with choice.
Yeah, it's saying that the player has perfect information to get the projective determinants, right?
Yeah, so that I have no problem with, and it's motivated, correct me if I'm wrong, by getting the deep roots of analysis on the real line to come out intelligibly. I've got no problem with that, and in fact, it seems quite reasonable that you could take. Just like you do with compactness, really, you could take these principles that seem restrictive down low, and when you raise them high enough, they become liberating. Always a lesson not to assume too quickly that we know what the sort of real existential valence of things is. But as far as the ones that are incompatible with choice, I still need either to understand that I'm wrong to regard AC as just dialectically necessary coming to the aid of what we were trying to say in the power set axiom, or I need a full-blooded ontological account of why, when I assert that a multiple exists, I'm not just automatically existentially committed to saying that all of the parts exist, because I'm
with you.
Do love that argument.
I'm in 100% agreement with you.
Okay.
But it doesn't get around the point I make about the structure of the game, projective determinacy, Turing determinacy, regardless of which one you want to choose. The structure of the game is the same with additional parts of play, right? Like one player has perfect information, right? As an example, that's the projective one, which is probably the most important in contemporary set theory because it's the one that relates to wooden cardinals. But just as that example shows, like we've got ZFC plus an assumption, either there is projective determinacy or there is a wooden cardinal, right? Like I think it's A or a set, I can't remember. It's on that page. But the point being that if it's, yes, hang on one second, mate. If you, there might be more nuggets, just give me 1 second, okay? I ate all the nuggets, just so you guys know, but don't tell them, okay? I'll get in trouble. But the point is that that projective determinacy with ZFC at that level and all those other ones above V equals L that I'm aware of, and there may be, I don't know all of them, but words are high enough, I think, that we can take it as the example. You still have the game theoretical structure the same, only with the addition of another part of the play, right? Which is that there is a player that has perfect information. And so the game structure is still there ontologically, right? The players, the game, the play, the strategies. We can't escape that. That's I think the crux of the point. I'm completely with you on throwing away the axiom of determinacy at that level. Like, is that the axiom we want to add in and remove choice? I don't think we do. I think we want to alter or modify the axiom of infinity, just like Gödel's talking about. And that's what a large cardinal axiom does, right?
Right.
And that's what the determinacy axioms are doing as well, because they're equivalent. Those higher order ones.
So I think then we disagree about almost nothing, because I'm all for shining a third light upon the things themselves. I mean, that's how we, by multiplying Abschattungen like that, that's how we start to have a concrete relation to the things themselves here, right? That isn't just textually bound. And I will say that the debates about this, how to go on, determinacy being one possible way, these are happening now. So it's a rather extraordinary thing that by considering this text of Badiou's, we've wound up in a place where stuff that is happening this year might actually be relevant to us in some way. In mathematics, that's an astonishing thing. I'm much more comfortable in, say, 1931. So if I have access to something that is going on now, that's great. And I'll reiterate that Hampkins thinks that we're at a crisis moment now, not foundations crisis, because we don't quite speak in those terms anymore, but a philosophical crisis in set theory. And if that's the case, fantastic. Zach again.
Yeah, I just had a random thought. John Dance, I was wondering if you could, well, I'd be interested to hear what you have to say, amplifying these thoughts about the ontological presuppositions behind this game theoretic way of posing things, right? The idea that there are players making choices and so on. Did you have anything more that you wanted to say about that?
Well, I guess I had two things, right? One is that you can define these determinacy axioms without using the game theoretical structure. You can say like that there is a Borel set. There's things like this, right? That you can do, and it's just, but again, it's just an equivalency, right? You can define it through this game too, which is the OG way of doing it, as it were, right? It's the original way in which it's structured, and so you can't really, you can ignore it, but you can't escape it, right? Just from a, in the math. I don't have enough of an expertise in ontology nor in this to formulate what that means.
Yeah, I guess I had.
Yeah, as I
I
said,
was just
though,
having
I
a
think.
sort of.
Sorry, you go, Zach. Go.
Oh, sorry. I was sort of having a random thought that what if that ends up being the more natural way in which perhaps I don't know anything about it, but I know that I know that there is this interesting strand in logic. I read a couple of Hintiger papers a long time ago. This interesting strand in sort of game theoretic formulations of things. What I find interesting about it, though, from a philosophical perspective is that what it seems to be encoding is some kind of assumption of the about the possibility of theory itself, right? Like the theoretical situation or something. The fact that one is a theorist and that therefore one is making some kind of assumptions about one's status as a theorist before one begins. So it's sort of in that respect, this technical sense of determinacy seems to dovetail with a more, let's say, philosophical sense of determinacy, the sort of the presupposition of the determinacy of thought. Like,
I think that's
know
what
if that
John's
makes any sense.
saying. You know, I think that's exactly what John was alluding to with higher logics or some of these other methods, right? The fear that I had when I put all this together, like, you know, as I've done this over the last decade, reading some of this stuff really slowly because this is not my field by any means, neither of them, but it feels more akin to theology or the old school term of metaphysics, right? To say, here's these two beings playing an infinite game. These are their strategies. Like at root, at just like observational level, you're like, I'm reading Baidu, and now I'm all of a sudden like getting into theology and accepting it. If I'm almost forced to.
I would just wonder if you could just, whether we need to call it theology, but we could just call it the opening of the theoretical standpoint.
Yeah,
or
sure.
something like that, right? Like in maybe an Aristotle sense.
Yeah, and look, like I said,
I
don't have that ontological. I couldn't place it in the canon properly. But that's just the first glance from my perspective on it, where it's terrifying.
Apologies. I do think there are going to be alternatives to a theological interpretation. In fact, it may give us a way of characterizing the theological interpretation, right? We might say the theological interpretation is one in which player one and player two are in some way reversible, right? So I could place myself in the position of the other, or the other could place themselves in the position of me, at least insofar as God is a subject or something like that, right? Classical theistic God, you've got something like the two-player model. On the other hand, with Hintika, the other player could be the thing in itself. From a Lacanian point of view, I think the other player could be the big other. And none of those are structured. So if you go those ways, I think you would be using an apparently symmetric structure, the game structure, in order to disclose these deep asymmetries between the two positions. And then maybe you would want to say theological interpretation would try to flip that back again and say that underneath that asymmetry, there's another subject over there, the perfect subject.
I hope you're right, John, and I think Baidu hopefully has something to say on this. I would point out, like, to tie it to what I said at the very beginning of why he was initially dismissive, right, in being an event of the higher order cardinals, was he saw it as a metaphysics, right. So it's interesting that it's not inescapable, but there's something to it, what he was saying initially. Look, there's other alternatives, right? Math might not equal ontology, but then it's sort of a very important linchpin, I think, in the entire set of arguments we've made through the three books. He may say that that's not the case any longer, but I find that hard to do away with. I think the answer is probably, John, like you said, it's moving up an order in logic or something else like that. There's alternatives, which mean these things can be explained away. And my own personal beliefs would like that to be the case. So.
And again, I think the astonishing contribution from Badiou is that if we talk about moving up a level or something like that, the usual impasses in philosophy of mathematics assume that we're using them as tools, right? And if nothing else, I think Badiou has given us this patient and overwhelming alternative to that, where we can have contact with these things, even if we're not in a position of mastery in relation to them. There are other things, there are other relations possible. There are other things that can happen. Is there, go ahead.
John, I was just going to say the other thing I haven't been able to figure out, again, it's like, I think this would take some time to ponder. It's how does just putting the deterministic axioms in instead of the large cardinal ones change the concept of the absolute, which he's discussing, right? I don't know if it does at all. You don't need the ultra filters, right? You don't need some of the non-principal ultra filters or things like this in a deterministic world. I mean, you still need to explain them because you can just replace them interchangeably, but
Right.
It begs the other question, but at least he's answered one side of that coin. So I don't know if it changes anything in terms of how he would interpret what he's already written with respect to this book or not. But I assume it may.
Well, I'm gonna end the recording and then speak practically for a moment, if that's all right.